our special guest, Carter Jackson. Now, I always get that wrong and want to say Jackson Carter, but I've got it round the right way, haven't I? Okay, so 3 years ago to this very week, Carter was like you, going, I've got my first British studies exam next week. Oh no. He survived his first British study exam, and the second one, and the third one, and then went back to WKU where he majored in architecture, correct? And after that decided that he'd not quite had enough of the UK. So came back and has been doing a master's up in York, which he had just completed. He handed his dissertation in just last week. Now, right. So you might wonder, what on earth is he doing here? He should surely be in the pub. But he's here. And mainly because most of his dissertation, as you can see from the title page, was Harlaxton Manor. And it's decorative art, Recasting style. So, I'm going to look at Jackson talk for me instead of messing up your thing. So, over to you.
It is great to be back at Harlaxton. I was here in the spring of 2016, so almost 3 years ago, a little bit over actually. And I didn't even know it, but I caught a bug for 19th century country houses. And I've always loved old houses and the stories behind old houses and houses that seem to have more to say. And you may have heard in class, I think you probably know a little bit about Harlaxton by now, you know about Gregory, and heard some of that, but it's been said that he embodied himself in the house's edifice, which to me implies that even though he's been gone for over 150 years, that there's still something left to say, that he's still telling us something and that his architecture has something to speak to us. So I began to dig into, with the help of Miss Linda Dawes, who has gone through and transcribed the inventories of Gregory's heirlooms. So I'm going to refer to those as the Gregory heirlooms. It was Gregory's collection of decorative art. And she's gone through with help of other faculty and has tried to just kind of dig at that and see what it was that he was so fascinated by, what he collected and what filled this house. Because really, Harlaxton is a shell now. The items that were in here I think had a lot to speak to the architecture, and they were in dialogue. So we're going to investigate that a bit, but unfortunately, there's not a whole lot left about Gregory's collection of decorative art. So I've saved that discussion for the very end of the presentation, and we'll touch on it a bit, but we're going to look at what the built fabric of Harlaxton has to say to us without the collection. So in order to do that, I've divided the lecture into two sections. It'll be pretty simple. The first one, we'll look at the exterior development of Harlaxton through the existing drawings, the architectural drawings before the house was built. It went through a few different schemes. The first architect was Anthony Salvin, and he's one of the canonical 19th century architects that built country houses like this. And he was replaced by William Byrne, and we're going to talk about what that meant for Harlaxton. We'll discuss what is the Elizabethan style, and why was that important? What was the moment that Harlaxton was born into, and how does the architecture interact with that? What were Gregory's preferences? That'll be part of the discussion of the decorative art. And then the second half, we'll look at Harlaxton's interiors, and we'll bring the exterior into clearer focus, understand its strands of influence. And when I was here, I thought of it as just this giant house with exuberant decoration, and I just thought it was very bold. I never really looked at it closely, so we're going to look at it closely and try to understand what is happening here. We'll compare it to other houses and contemporary descriptions of the house when it was filled with Gregory's collection, the few that there are. And we'll conclude by bringing the art back into the house and understanding how it all came together. So this is my interpretation of Harlaxton, given the sources that we have, as scant as they are. And at the end, I'm going to open it up to questions, and I expect you to challenge me and ask me questions, because I am using what other scholars have published on Harlaxton, just trying to take it a little bit further so there's room for other people. So, 1837. Now, I don't think you've gotten to the Victorians quite yet, but 1837 was a significant year for England. Queen Victoria was becoming Queen Victoria. But what else happened in the 1830s? There was something significant that happened architecturally. Can anyone tell me what this is a painting of? Anyone? Dr. Bujay? Yes. Yes, yes. Yeah. So this is J.M.W. Turner's painting of the burning of the Houses of Parliament. Houses of Parliament burned in 1834, and there was a competition for the rebuilding of Parliament that was open to anyone who could design anything they wanted as long as it was in the Elizabethan Gothic style. So we ask, okay, well, what is the Elizabethan style, and why was that important? Why was that selected to become the new national symbol? Well, Elizabethan architecture is the architecture we associate with Queen Elizabeth I. It was the end of insular English architecture, and it began the dependence on continental print sources. So we're looking back at ancient Rome, pattern books from the continent. Before we had Pinterest and Google to get ideas on architecture, pattern books were the thing. So you would have pictures of columns or engravings of old buildings, and these were the kind of things that Gregory collected when he was compiling an inspiration for Harlaxton. But the Elizabethan style is fascinating. It's this in-between Old England and what we think of as Inigo Jones or later English classicism, where the master masons, you didn't really have architects yet, you had master masons. And they would work with the masons to try to bring these ideas to life, but they didn't fully understand how to use the classical orders of architecture. So it creates this kind of interesting hybrid style, but that is what Elizabethan architecture is. It's German, French, and Dutch pattern books warping these classical details. But why Elizabethan architecture? Well, Elizabethan architecture had the ability to recall Old England. So the 1830s, we think of industrialization. The world was changing rapidly. And Gothic architecture and Elizabethan architecture was a way to bring the country back to a period of morality, of moral truth, Old English values, and it was pitting itself against the classicists who believed that classical architecture was the best way to express the values of Britain at the time. But by selecting an Elizabethan or Gothic style for Parliament, architecture was making a stance for the architecture of Old England. So we ended up with this. This is Charles Barry's design for Parliament. It's become, after this it becomes very popular, and it was popular in the time for the same reasons I've listed, the appeal to Old England, all of that. Charles Barry, also one of the canonical architects of the time. This is Highclere House. It was the style, the Elizabethan style was so popular that people wanted to have their houses renovated or draped in kind of a Gothic or Elizabethan fabric to kind of get in on this fashion. So Highclere House, that's that. Charles Barry is hired to make it into Highclere Castle, which has become almost as iconic as the Houses of Parliament thanks to Downton Abbey. And actually, I'm going to go back a bit, because this, if you look, the windows here barely moved in this renovation. He added towers to the corner, a tower in the center, but it was really just cloaking this house in something that was Old English. I think it's pretty neat. So, we get the idea that this was a kind of a comfortable style, and something very, very well liked. There are certain commentators that spoke a bit about architecture at the time, and one was John Loudon, who spoke with Gregory, actually visited Harlaxton, and he had a few things to say about Elizabethan architecture. He described what his ideal English villa would be. He said, "I should build a villa in the Old English style, that of a blunt H plan, a center and two projecting wings, inferior offices in the basement to form a symmetrical whole, and the whole supporting a battlement or parapet, dignified and imposing." And he goes on and on and on. But he's describing what he thinks architecture country houses should be. It's illustrated in these engravings here. This is John Nash's Mansions of England in Olden Time. These look like they're from the 16th century, but they were actually trying to recall those Old English ideas. So both left and right. But the one on the right is a bulletin hall, which people say is quite similar to Harlaxton. It was actually built in the 16th century. But they are just from the 1830s, the same time that this house was designed and built. So we begin to think, how does Harlaxton engage with this? These ideas of Old England, and this is it. This is the first existing schematic drawing that we have of Harlaxton by Salvin. So we see here, it's appealing to what Loudon was saying his ideal house would be. It's an H-plan. You have two projecting wings coming forward and backward. You've got the battlements up top, oriel window in the front. It looks like Harlaxton. You see the two ranges on either side flanking the forecourt, but there aren't any of the crazy wild chimneys up in the top. It's a very subdued example of Harlaxton. But it does seem like something that you could almost imagine being in Joseph Nash's books. It seems indigenous to Britain, and it seems trustworthy. But it's not what we end up with. It also looks a bit like Montague House, which was built around 1600. Materiality, it's the same general shape, and it's pretty clear that even though it wasn't one of the examples that Gregory listed as being his inspiration, I think there's some undeniable similarities. This is another angle of it. It's changed a little bit, but you can see the forecourt. Right now it bows out, it bends out, feels kind of baroque. This is flat. The terraced gardens on the right are just a wall with, that looks kind of Tudor almost. And the whole thing looks a little bit Tudor. It looks earlier than Harlaxton. It looks like it's not quite as refined or as developed. This is the back, and you see kind of the same deal. There's hood molding, which is what goes along the top and pops over the windows. That's a very Tudor sort of motif. Again, not all of it. I wanted to pull out some specific details because I think these are quite telling. These are things that change. So but it also looks remarkably similar to this. This is Old Harlaxton Hall. So if we think about what are the elements that make this stand out to us, what do we think? We kind of see this and think, it seems comfortable, it seems like England. It's the battlemented parapets, it's the, of course it's kind of overgrown, but it's the irregularity, and it seems like something Tudor and comfortable. Has the same sort of retired character, and this is actually in Joseph Nash's Mansions of England in olden time. But as we know, or you may not, Gregory demolished Old Harlaxton Hall and built what we're in right now. So clearly this was not what he was after. It is quite beautiful, and it is quite what they were lauding at the time. This is actually a drawing by James Deason, who worked in Anthony Salvin's office. And when they were in the process of designing Harlaxton and taking inspiration, they took lots of sketches. And Salvin was actually known for his attention to archaeological detail. He would sketch buildings growing up. He actually conducted renovations to Windsor Castle. He was quite well known for his attention to being historically correct. Another angle of it. Loudon said, after visiting Old Harlaxton Hall, it was in the bottom of a rich valley with a very picturesque surrounded by a moat, and a large gallery goes on. So the hall is raised at one end, which is very hung with old armor, portraits, and various other objects. Two principal furniture. And this would have been around 1840. Bernard Burke, in another publication, another commentator, calls Old Harlaxton Hall a singular and remarkable ancient mansion that continued to be the seat of the Gregory family until the end of the last century, the 18th century. He says it still stands, and we trust that it may long stand as one of the most curious specimens of English domestic architecture during the reign of the Plantagenets and Tudors. We do know that the house was in bad shape, but given all of the praise for this house and how it was appealing to what Parliament was evoking, why would Gregory choose to demolish it? We talked about how Salvin was capable of remodeling old houses. It was what he was known for. And while it's obviously in quite a decayed state, I see no reason why Gregory couldn't have put his money into this house if he so wanted. But he chose not to. So, in order to understand why Gregory made the decision he did to demolish the house, build something new, and not use the first couple drawings that we saw, we have to understand what was feeding his imagination at the time. So in this same interview with Udon, he discusses the books that were in his library, and I think that's a good place to start. They were largely print books, the Pinterest of the period, if you will. Pattern books that discussed or just illustrated examples of French, Austrian, German, Dutch, and Italian architecture and palaces. Very few, almost no references to anything English. And these are a series of French prints that he would have owned and seen in the books that he specifically had. And the same goes for this. This is Wendell Dietrich on the left, and you might see this and think, oh, that looks a little bit like Harlaxton. That looks like something I might understand. On the right, we have, so he was German. On the right, we have, by Friedman de Vries, another, this is a portal, and it's just showing two different options of decorating this portal. But these are the things, these are the exact sort of pattern books that Gregory had. Here again, this is a French one. That's the French palace that he had. So, we also know that while he was building Harlaxton, I think it was 1835, mid-1830s, Salvin went to Germany, and he talked a little bit about the trip in his diary. And he bought prints of Heidelbergschloss, which is what this is. And all of this, Heidelberg, the prints I've just shown you, are all examples of continental mannerism. So 16th century attempts to reach the Italian neoclassical architecture that was so popular at the time. Mannerism it's the distortion of architectural, and in this simple talk architecture, distortion of architectonic elements that manipulates them and amplifies them, injects bold relief, and it kind of makes you uncomfortable, and it was before the Baroque. It amplifies plasticity. It was at a time when Michelangelo and Da Vinci became less known as Italian specifically and became appreciated more as just European art. It was a highly adaptable style, and it replaced the decorative vocabulary that is inherent to many specific cultures. So this all means that mannerism was able to blur the lines between national styles. And so we think about, these are the things that were feeding Gregory, that were feeding Salvin at the time. Salvin likely, I think, went to Germany at the request of Gregory, given the period he went. So what happens at Harlaxton when all these influences come back? So this is the second set of schematic drawings that we have of the house. This was actually the last set that Salvin did, and there are a few notable changes. Of course, we don't have the range on the left, the service range, but the house's ornamental vocabulary is becoming Harlaxton, it's maturing. The house no longer looks relaxed in the same way it did. Like Old England, it's become stately and ominous. It commands its landscape in a way that it never did before. And even the figures, you have kind of in fancy dressed women and men, the swans, all of that isn't really recalling Joseph Nash. There's a different sensibility at play. The gardens are balustraded, the forecourt, as I said, is bending, and it's expressive in a new way. And it just looks genteel, looks different. So, because these are so small, we need to look at the built fabric. But this is the final set of drawings that we have before Byrne took over. So we can begin by thinking about the approach to Harlaxton. When I first came to Harlaxton, I remember thinking, all I can see is the very top of it. You can see the chimneys and the spires and the cupola sticking up. And this axial approach from a mile away is an incredibly French precedent, actually. And as we get a little bit closer, we bring it into view and we see these things towering up. And that to me is what's most impressive at first. Because of this, we can begin to describe it in a different sort of language. The house is definitely pulling ornament elements that were Elizabethan, but it is recombining them in a way, unlike anything else that the Elizabethans did. There's similarities to be drawn here to Chambord. Pierre Gascard described this chateau, the 16th century chateau. He said, all we can see at first is what caps the chateau, raising it towards the sky. Construction's not added to, but traversing the building's mass like a range of organ pipes. And when I heard that, I thought, that sounds a lot like how I would describe Harlaxton. So if we get a little bit closer, we can look at this ornament in more detail. So these are called cartouches down here. Cartouches are like parchment in a way, and they curl up. They're a Mannerist device. Well, they go back further than Mannerism, but in the case here, they are plastic. And when I say plastic, I mean filled with bold relief. And they look like they're almost literally interpreting these prints right here by Poutine. And as we go up, this continues. It's incredibly bold. That is not what we saw in the first illustrations of Harlaxton. And if we go back to Heidelbergschloss, we see this guy over here, and I think there are some distinct similarities to be made. I wanted to include this. This is Stoke Rockford Hall. It was also designed by Byrne. It's just down the road, but it kind of gives an example of what happens when you don't do that to a house. It's boring in comparison. It's been called a pastiche of Harlaxton, and you can kind of see why, but it is not nearly as exuberant. It's not nearly as playful in its ornament, and it just lacks that Harlaxton wow factor, if you will. So that picture on the left is a bit blurry, but you can see some similarities there. The debris, yes, that's the portal that I wanted to bring in. I just feel like there's similarity in form, and it's almost combining elements of both the tortured figures, the swags of fruit, the ribbons, all of these things. While they are Elizabethan, these are the things that the Elizabethans drew upon to design their houses. That's what's being exaggerated here, these elements that are foreign, and it's not like what we've seen before. This I also thought was quite telling. This is just the clock, of course, but the typeface isn't what we consider like Times New Roman. It doesn't look like something we would think of on a typical clock. That actually reminds me a bit of what we see in 1930s Germany. It looks very German. That's called Franktur. And when I saw that, I remember thinking, that definitely doesn't look right. And once you begin to see these elements, it's hard to unsee them. And as we move along, this is the Conservatory. Again, same story. On the right, there are some engravings by Degrees, and they're almost literally interpreted here. Curvilinear, bulbous forms. These two figures, these faces right there in the middle, don't quite match the stone of the surrounding structure, and I happen to think they may have been elements that, or items that Gregory got on his travels abroad, because that's a lot of what he did at Harlaxton. Again, so we have these banded columns, very bold. This window I've always thought was kind of interesting. There are a couple of these around the house. It's called a Kant style window, and it was very popular in Tudor times, and it does this. And on the right we can see the drawing by John Thorpe, also a mason at the time, so this would have been 16th century. But what's interesting is to the right of it we see something much more exuberant. Again, it's not attempting to be just Old English. There's something else at play. Now, we get kind of tired of seeing stuff like this, and we think of Harlaxton as this, but if you take a close look at the service range, there's a whole different sensibility at play. This looks like what we had seen in some of the first drawings of Harlaxton. It looks a lot like the other houses that Salvin was designing at the time. It's got this Tudor sort of look to it. It looks primitive compared to the Harlaxton that we've been seeing. You have the battlemented parapets, the hood molding over all these different items, the pointed arches. And it looks like it could have been designed by a different hand. If you saw this and didn't know it was Harlaxton, you might not think it was anything like Harlaxton. And as we move further and further away from the house, this becomes more and more the case. So this is the Carriage House, obviously. And what's here, this is called a hipped roof on the side, and it kind of cants inward. That's not an Elizabethan architectural vocabulary. It's more French. The gable is the Dutch style. The court of honor, which is actually kind of what you progress through to go into the Carriage House, all of that has continental precedent. And we think that this was designed by Byrne. I happen to think it was. The first two drawings we saw, sets of drawings, were definitely Salvin. Byrne would have completed the conservatory. That was not done when Salvin was finished. He would have done the back half, what I just showed you with the Kant windows. And I think he would have done this as well. So he was capable of a variety of architecture. He would have also likely done the service range. Until we find out more, that is what we're going to go with. So to think that there was a whole different sensibility at play, a whole different architect or a whole different patron. I believe Salvin, or I believe Gregory was alive when this was done. So we have to ask, why would he intentionally change this language so much from place to place? What is he trying to say behind this? And when we consider the separation in Victorian times of, if you've watched Downton Abbey's a bit later, but the idea is there that the servants above and below stairs are distinctly separate. So when we think about this architecture being what the servants would have seen, being the servants' range, what is that saying? It's denoting this architecture as inferior to the continentally infused amalgam that we've seen elsewhere. And it almost kind of provides a sense of progression, a chronological progression. If this is early Tudor architecture, what we've seen before is much later. So the house is almost moving through time in a way, if you look at it like that. Now, this is the other side of the Carriage House that we don't really think about very much. But I happen to think it looks more like Antwerp City Hall than any sort of Elizabethan house. Again, the hipped roof all the way around. The rounded dormers are not on Antwerp City Hall, but they're also continental. They're called bullseye dormers. Again, not pieces of Elizabethan architectural vocabulary. So, as the house is pulled apart, as buildings are constructed away from the Elizabethan house, they're free to become something else. They're free to become something European, something that perhaps is more in line with what Gregory, the architect, envisioned. So we come back to Harlaxton, and in summary, we've called this ornament exaggerated, we called it amplified in the past, we called it Baroque, but I think the more important thing is that it's progressing away from what is Old English. It is Mannerist, I happen to think. If we think about what was going on the continent at the time that the Elizabethans were building this sort of stuff, Mannerism is the equivalent. It was important because it could blur the lines between international ornament, and if we think about this desire to make the house cosmopolitan, it also makes sense that he would reject the original drawings for the new Harlaxton and knock down Old Harlaxton Hall. It doesn't emphasize what is indigenous to Britannia. Instead, it's showing what is common between England and the continent. However, these elements are at odds with 19th century commentators. The idea that you would exaggerate these things that seemed almost uncomfortable and just a bit garish. A commentator, Mr. Hakewell, in 1835, refers to Continental Mannerist ornament, what we see here, as the barbarous combinations which crowd the Netherlands, and says that the British should credit our countrymen for having so sparingly introduced such barbarisms. In 1837, another writer faults the Germans for the impurities on the Italian model and says that these are what's peculiar to the Elizabethan style, but this implies that this is what was supposed to be avoided, not embraced, and definitely not exaggerated. Instead, Harlaxton is amplifying these things. It doesn't remind us of the architecture where it was paternalistic and the lord of the manor was there to serve as tenants. And instead, there's something different at play. We know that Gregory was a bit of a grand tourer. He traveled at least for 3 years, according to newspapers, prior to building Harlaxton in Italy and in France. And he collected many objects to put in the house. So in my opinion, this is suggesting that Gregory was using the innate assimilative capacity of the Elizabethan style, this capacity to rely and pull continental print sources to bring the house into the 19th century and in a way exploit the Elizabethan style and what makes the Elizabethan style in a way that a worldly man like him, a well-traveled man, a reclusive man, could use it in a manner that expressed completely different sensibilities than someone who was trying to be the old English gentleman or really had any reasons for reviving his chosen style. We will see a standalone microcosm of the stylistic transformation, evolution, if you will, at the Gatehouse. So when we approach Harlaxton, this, to me, screams Old England. It's asymmetrical, it is battlemented, got leaded windows, it looks fortified. It looks like something that really commands respect for Old England to approaching visitors. You've got the heraldry, the buttresses, the four-pointed arch. But on the other side, it's symmetrical. It is classically infused, its trade, its buttresses for pilasters, and it becomes a microcosm of what I believe is this fusion. It's reminding visitors as they leave of the recasting of the Elizabethan style into something cosmopolitan. It's also illustrating, as we discussed with the service range, the chronological progression through time from Old Tudor to continentally infused amalgam. So, this brings our end of the end of our discussion of the exterior, but we will move to the interior with these ideas in mind. So with the exterior of a house, you are kind of bound to a consistent decorative scheme. And we've seen Old Tudor, much later architecture, but again, by and large, this house is passed as Elizabethan. We call it Neo-Elizabethan. It's exaggerating certain things here and there, but that is the style. Inside, you have the benefit of having multiple separate spaces that can evolve on their own. You can walk from room to room and go from country to country, if you will. But that isn't what Harlaxton does. We have rooms like this, and we have rooms like the Great Hall, and we have rooms like the entrance hall, but somehow, as you walk through the house, nothing ever really feels misplaced. You don't get to one room and think, oh my gosh, this doesn't look anything like what the house told me it was going to look like. It all seems to fit, which is quite remarkable, and that is what we're going to dissect now. It seems to progress smoothly, and again, this is my interpretation of Harlaxton, and I welcome if you challenge me afterwards. I will argue that this is actually a sequence of spaces, a chronological progression of refinement. We will begin by discussing the plan and its ornament, and then we'll conclude with a discussion of its lost art. And I should also add that this will stick with the staterooms because I believe this progression is most explicit here, but we will discuss Gregory's private rooms in some way. So, Gregory, Salvin, Byrne, these were the guys who brought the house together, but the interiors have been kind of a mystery, and I happen to think that the Crace firm. The Craces were a major interior design firm at the time. They designed interiors for the Houses of Parliament and King George IV at Windsor Castle. John Gregory Crace became a partner of the firm, and it's possible that John Gregory Crace was related to Gregory Gregory. And both of them were fascinated by old French art, specifically the Ancien regime. These are slightly earlier than that. These are actually, one is a trade card, kind of advertising the Crace firm. The second one is an invitation to an open house. But what's unique about this is they're both in the French Renaissance style. They're earlier than what was typically produced in French interiors. We think of Louis XIV through XVI. This is French Renaissance, so that's something to consider. We'll dive into why that's important as well. Crace and Gregory both visited Europe numerous times, and both of them had an idea that, or a broader knowledge of the progression of ornament through time. So if you were going to design a house that was going to bring together various strands of influence, the Craces were a great firm to hire. Gregory Crace actually went to Heidelbergschloss as well. He went with a friend, like Salvin, we said went, and with his friend he said, "It surpassed in grandeur and beauty what we had expected, as to render us incapable of speaking for a minute or two." And we'll talk about how that's important, but I want you to hold on to that. So we will see how this knowledge of the progression of ornament through time, of history, of style, how style is influenced by ideas, how that allowed Harlaxton to become something coherent. So, if we begin with the entrance hall. When I first arrived at Harlaxton, I remember thinking, this isn't really what I thought it would be. This is really, it's kind of dark, it's kind of small, and it's not the impressive entrance that we think this kind of house should have. But we do see this light at one end where the staircase is. The light kind of indicates that it's beginning our processional route through the house. But down here, it seems primitive and Tudor. You have these stone horns and axes and consoles that are giant. But you also have subtle references to a delicacy, which you see in the French balustrade. So down low, we see these leaded windows, and as we go up, the ornament becomes more refined and a bit more expressive. And I was actually here at a time when there was some painting work being done, and I spoke with one of the painters, and he said that these, I don't know what you would call them, they're pendants, these little stone motifs right here that kind of dot up and down the third picture from the left. They would have coated the left wall of, the right wall of the far right picture. You can still see holes where these things would have been. So the point is that this space would have been a lot to take in. It would have been a lot of ornament as you go up, and it would have been kind of overwhelming. But this isn't to say, and you have the beautiful ceiling, but it's not to say that it's all Old English. So the columns still recall Dieterlen. And even if you look at the bottom of these columns, these bases, they look like almost exact copies of what we see at Harlaxton right there. The French balustrade continues. So we're continuing those same references to Germany and France that were found outside, of course, with references to Old England. But it all seems, like I said, a bit uncomfortable. It seems to clash. You have heavy mixed with delicate, light and dark, change of materiality, and you kind of are in this space, and no one ever really hangs out in the entrance hall and decides to just camp out there. It's not somewhere that's inviting. So we have to think, you have an entire house to let these strands of influence unfold. Why have you combined all of them in the very first space that we encounter? What does that say? Well, I think a good place to look, and again, we don't have much on Gregory and his thoughts on this, but we can look at what the early 19th century was saying about the evolution of style. Thomas Newell, in an 1839 book entitled Details of Elizabethan Architecture, wrote that the Elizabethan style was part of an effort common to Germany, France, and the Netherlands to reach neoclassical architecture, as we've discussed, to reach the Cinquecento. He cites the palaces of Heidelberg, the Chateau at Fontainebleau, and the town hall at Antwerp, things we've all seen, as being part of the same moment that was trying to approach the refinement of Italian neoclassicism. To him, these things were all kind of one and the same. It says, because they were striving to reach the enrichment of imaginary and fantastic representations of animals and foliage adopted in ancient Roman edifices. All of those things were trying to do that. So to him, these undesirable absurdities and what was called barbarous combinations that crowd the Netherlands, these were all part of the same movement. And by unifying these elements in the first space we encounter, we begin a progression through the house that unfolds them and unpacks them and makes them more refined. So as we progress into the screen's passage, we immediately sense this a little bit more refinement. We have this dado rail that surrounds the space, the marble floor, the classical molding around the doors, and then we progress into the Great Hall, where, let's see, it looks acceptably Elizabethan. It makes sense. We have consistency. It seems Old English. There's a high end and a low end, a bay window with a platform. All of that recalls Old England. It also recalls Odd Hall, which we see right here. It's the same sort of paneling going halfway up, the trusses, and there's a small difference though. All of this at the end is low relief. These squares of the paneling are completely different from what we see at Harlaxton. Here we have these projections in the paneling that look like old Italian shields. We have bold molding. We have these Atlantean statues that are all of a completely different sensibility. So it's the deep, the Tudor style, if you will. Again, if they were trying to be archaeologically Elizabethan, on the far right is Wollerton Hall. You have these little tiny figures supporting the trusses. That would have been what he would shoot for. Instead, we have something that looks German. What's in the middle is German. And I think that pendant is way too big to be trying to be archaeologically Elizabethan. The dining room, similar story. It looks Tudor and it looks Jacobethan at first. But the details begin to betray the Old Englishness. We have putti, or we call them all the naked babies that were kind of strange. But that's what they are, they're putti. They are delicate. They introduce a new materiality. Gregory's coats of arms are no longer in the same sort of stone that they were before. They look delicate. They're in marble stone. The cornice is a buildup of layers that looks Elizabethan, and I agree with that, but it also looks a bit like this. This is what we find at the Chateau at Fontainebleau. The putti, similar placement, very bold, very plastic. And even here, the swags of fruit underneath each of the shields, and the curling of the cartouches, the scrolling ribbons. Yes, it's Elizabethan, but it's also being amplified, I believe, to reference something else, something further afield, something, in this case, French. You see it in the anteroom. These panels were likely taken from the continent. We'll have someone, Dr. Mark Valenzuela, I believe, in the next couple of weeks is going to speak to you about the paneling. But they were coded messages in many French chateaux that would be musical instruments or something referencing the purpose of the room. But they kind of indicate what's to come. But here I still think we see references to the bold plasticity of Fontainebleau. So, at the Cedar Staircase, what do we get here? Well, it's an intersection of all the spaces that we've discussed so far. At first, we see this just sense of height. I think that's the first thing that strikes you. But it's actually an illusion. And as it rises, it only rises one floor, but it looks like it rises 2 or 3. Everything is amplified, and there are trumpeting mermaids, and Rococo decoration in the surrounding rooms becomes shells. It's almost uncontrollable. And we see this transition from dark to light. And with that becomes a fundamental transformation. There's a progression that we've seen. But as each of these elements we've discussed so far throughout the house can be called mannerist, they've been limited to ornament that's been amplified. Here, this progression from light to dark, this almost it's an appeal to emotion. All of this is something different. It's something Baroque. It unites these styles and progresses through time past mannerism. And we see the classical orders introduced for the third time, or for the first time, excuse me, in these columns down here. So it's almost like you've reached classical Italy. The house is moving. So in this room, we see a continued progression. If we compare this to the anteroom, it does seem more evolved. It seems more delicate. It references, instead of Fontainebleau, maybe more Louis XV in the Rococo paneling. There's more of everything. And it's a terminal room along the processional route, meaning that it's it is the last room you can come to. You have to go back to continue on through Harlaxton. So the house is moving a little bit towards neoclassicism. And we see this diaper pattern, the blue and gold, was called the Crace diaper, which is evidence of the Crace work at the house. There. And the long gallery, which is, again, one of the terminal rooms. But to reach neoclassicism, you would think, well, why not go to English neoclassicism? Why is it French? If the house is progressing through time, wouldn't it make sense to go to something English? But that would undermine the point that the Elizabethan style is assimilatist. It's become cosmopolitan. And by assimilating French neoclassicism, what Gregory and his collection of art likely indicate that Gregory thought was the supreme, was the peak of artistic capability. The Elizabethan house, Harlaxton, has basically become the channel through which the history of decorative art ends at the Ancien regime. It is the supreme accomplishment of the Elizabethan style. So the long gallery is, again, axial. And I want to point out that there is this axis that runs, of course you can see, runs through these rooms all the way to the anteroom. And if you're in the long gallery, there's an axis that runs out that door to the right, all the way down, up the stairs, and to the Dutch Canal. Also something very French. So it reminds us of this evolution as well. These figures, the cherub on the right, also looks a bit like something you would have seen in the staircase. You have the classical columns as well, but we've reached refinement. Gregory's private rooms are also quite French. I happen to think that this room right here, room 317, is a likely candidate for being Gregory's bedroom. Even though it's not smack in the middle of the house, this niche, this alcove to put a bed in, was an incredibly French. And he would look forward down this path, up the Dutch Canal, again, something very French. And if the house is evolving toward what's French, this is a logical place to end. So we will conclude by, and I'll wrap it up, we will conclude by discussing the Catalogue of Gregory heirlooms, which is really the most illuminating source that we have. It's what Linda has looked at a lot and transcribed. So like I said, Gregory lived in France and Italy for 3 years in the 1820s. He collected lots of objects, big objects. He wasn't that into paintings. He was into anything that was huge and hard to move, which is why, and I'd be happy to look around the house with you afterwards, but there are certain elements that we can see as being not indigenous to Britain, but things that he's brought over. Bernard Burke, someone who visited the house, said that he collected the most beautiful objects in virtue and taste in France and Italy, and commenced the Palace of Harlaxton as a fitting receptacle for his varied acquisitions, yet it is extremely difficult to convey an adequate idea of a noble mansion. Unfortunately, it hasn't gotten a whole lot easier to convey an idea of the mansion. These things were sold off in 1878, and this is the catalog that basically said this is what we're going to sell. It's a Christie's catalog. So we're left with scant inventories, a few stereographs, and brief contemporary accounts, but we do know that his taste was eclectic. And we can piece together a few things. First of all, there are few references to Old England in the things that he owned. In the entrance hall, where you would typically have references to Old England. You might have armor or old flags, those kind of things. We know that there were armor and old family paintings, according to contemporary accounts, in Old Harlaxton Hall. But those things are not noted in this inventory. These are two busts that would have been in the screen's passage. So a few things have turned up. This is actually an item that Gregory owned. This is the Stereograph of the Great Hall. This would have been with Gregory's heirlooms in place. There were a few references to Old England. He had portraits of the Earl of Colchester, the Duke of Buckingham, Mary Queen of Scots, King Henry VIII, and Charles I. He had chairs belonging to the Duke of York and the Dukes of Saxony, 2 large oak tables with benches, but the international influences are there and in some ways outweigh these English things. 2 Venetian lanterns, a Chinese gong with screen, Indian bowls, Persian rugs, a lofty oak sideboard from the continent, and busts of Napoleon, Marie Louise, Count Pozzo di Borgo, Emperor Francis, likely of Tuscany, all proudly cosmopolitan. In the dining room, similar story. 2 16-foot long walnut tables. This is kind of how the inventory reads, and it's kind of dry. 28 chairs in crimson damask, and a large Spanish chandelier. So we can begin to understand this characterization made by another person who visited Harlaxton, Mr. Rogers, W.G. Rogers, who wrote in 1864 in a letter after visiting that Gregory positioned his jaspers, cabinets of porcelain of famous or of fabulous value, Boule cabinetry, which is French, rare sculptures, delicate carvings, and Italian furniture, all in glorious and unreadable confusion. So we think these items didn't directly align with the spaces then, did they? But if we think about the way the house has progressed through time, it's never really married to any one style. It's a hybrid throughout. So, by not being bound to one style, in a sense, the architecture is able to envelop everything and it can seem commensurate with it. When you realize this, even though it seemed illegible to Rogers, if you look at the architecture, it begins to frame this collection and it's consciously cosmopolitan. These are a couple of objects that were in either the anteroom, which is just down there, or what was known as the drawing room, this room, before it became known as the gold room. He had French objects, Boule tables and chests, tables topped with lazuli, gilt chairs, once owned by Madame de Pompadour. He owned these, also look very French, gilt candelabra, marquetry tables, gilt armchairs. You kind of get the picture on that. This is the long gallery at the same time, and it is also one of the few stereographs that we have. But we see Louis XVI style chairs, a Dutch Doomer cabinet, which is not French, different French tapestries, but again, there's a sense of eclecticism. The rooms were not married to any specific style. Harlaxton's floor plan is also very linear. As you're going through, you don't have a lot of the rooms that were associated with the Victorians, a billiards room or a smoking room. The rooms are intentional, and they were designed, I believe, to funnel you through in a way where you open a door and it's almost like a museum. We know that Gregory wasn't big into entertaining. He didn't want large parties. The house had a different set of sensibilities. It recalls, in this sense, the grand touring houses, spacious rooms, axial formality, the houses that were designed in the 18th century to display a large collection of art. So we compare this to contemporary houses. This is the great drawing room at Windsor Castle. George IV was probably the biggest tastemaker of the day, and he was a huge Francophile. He and the Duchess of Rutland at Belvoir Castle both decorated rooms in very literal French styles, and he even hired the design firm Morel & Seddon to integrate the collection of old French furniture that he had with new pieces to make it almost impossible to distinguish what was made in 1726 versus 1826. But both of these, Windsor and Belvoir, were part of a hierarchy where the aristocracy set the taste and society imitated it as closely as possible. However, we've seen that Gregory didn't unify his collection. He displayed rooms as a grand touring connoisseur and a romantic antiquarian. He chose to demolish old Harlaxton Hall and get rid of the English restrictiveness that came with it. He built a new house that did laud Old England, but not quite like Parliament, in a new way. He exploited the inconsistencies of his collection to, I believe, inspire a one-off hybridization of styles that asserts the Elizabethan style as the champion of artistic progression in Europe. It was a progression that gave the house a sense of permanence, and it was the vessel through which these styles evolved, and in that way allowed the house to express a sense of ownership over the collection. It was the vessel through which these things came to be, in that sense. It makes the house appear as though it's progressed through history, and it makes the Ancien regime, classical France, seem compatible with England, Old England. And I will conclude by quoting the house decorators and painters guide of the era. This guy said that nothing is more offensive to the educated and critical eye than the blending of ornaments of one mode with the outline of another. But Harlaxton has challenged this in just about every way. We know that Gregory left no heir, and the house it almost in a way was what he wanted to leave. He says, according to the memoir of a visitor, that the house was his amusement, as hunting or shooting or feasting may be the objects of other people, and the pursuit of which has led him to all parts of the world, and to mix with every variety of nation and culture. It is not irrational, although he should never inhabit his house, this guy says, and he may be toiling and saving for the benefit of persons he cares nothing about. He didn't live here long, and he didn't know anything about us, but he was benefiting and toiling for us. And I am sure that he never imagined his house would become a study abroad home for Americans. But you all go out into the world, into Europe, every weekend, and you bring back the best of Europe to England, and you bring it back home with you, just like Gregory did. And for that, I think he would be incredibly proud. Thank you.
Carter, are you happy to take questions?
Yes, and I have some sources here if anybody's interested in.
I'm sure it's amazing to think of the house in this way, to have a lecture about the house whilst we're sat in the house, listening, looking at pictures of this room whilst we're sat in this room. It's really good. So, does anybody actually have any questions? Oh, lots and lots. Why don't you come up here? Carter, why don't you come up here? Because then people won't hear you. Which, over here.
Yes. Well, I happen to think that those are likely pieces that he got from the continent. And again, I don't think he's trying to specifically copy any French style, because it's difficult to place that. But that's kind of that's my point with the collection being eclectic. It makes everything commensurate. As far as the Putti go, I had a feeling that'd be a question that I would get asked. I think it's kind of a reference to the Fontainebleau style. It's definitely not something you would consider Elizabethan. I tried counting the number of Putti in here once, and I think there are over 60. If anybody wants to count them, you can do that.
If you look at the dragons, if you stand in the middle of the long gallery and look at the door going in the anteroom, the dragons don't meet in the middle. It's still made for the room. I think they're different in the middle. So I think it's something like that.
I think so too. There's an argument that he just wanted the ceiling to be centered for some reason, because the doors are not centered in the room. But I do think that he got them from abroad. And it's hard to dissect what is actually French and what isn't. There have been books or a few publications here and there about it, but it's kind of a mystery. Yes?
Thank you, as British person, because you've enlightened us, and we are very guilty, as we've had this conversation before, of being surrounded by country houses and don't really pay attention to the places. I'm also comforted because I'm absolutely sure Gregory would After the illustrated state of the nation at the moment, but yeah. But a more general, overview of the, you know, the point you made today. To what extent?
So this is coming from one of our Meta family people.
This is Steve and Val Twigg, who are a super Meta family. Wow. Well, you know, when I was here, that's really hard to quantify. I never thought I would come back and study Harlaxton specifically. I've loved old houses my whole life. And if you're gonna, like I said in the beginning, if you're going to study old houses, it's fun to study old houses with a story. So I was drawn back to Harlaxton, but was the question how the experience, or
To what extent how do you think
direction of my life? Yeah, well, when I was here, I was kind of disgruntled with architecture at the time. I considered going other directions, and I came back to the States, reinvigorated with my passion for architecture, and came back to York to pursue architectural history. And in no small part to Harlaxton, the people here. The faculty have been incredible in helping me orchestrate my research, and I plan to go back to the States and pursue a PhD, and like to be a museum curator one day. So I can't quantify that. This has been huge for me. Yeah, I'm very grateful. Anyone else?
I very much love the idea of sort of progression.
Yeah. Are you referring to the follies or the way they're laid out? Or yeah. I think that's a great essay to write. I think it's a very similar idea. What's interesting to me is that when you're in this room and you look out, you don't see anything that looks exactly Elizabethan. You know, you see this terrace that looks Italian, or kind of ambivalent in what it's referencing. It looks classical, neoclassical. So there's definitely a dialogue between being inside, looking outside for one thing. But I do think, and again, this research didn't really delve into the gardens that much. But there's definitely, I would say it's the same sensibility. It's not just trying to be Old English, but it is doing it via a style that is inherently capable of assimilating Europe. And to answer your question, yes, and I'd love to know more. I've heard that too. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I was not mistaken about that. Yes. Well, Gregory traveled Europe. Salvin went to Heidelberg, and John Gregory Crace went. So people do, yeah, more. Oh, definitely. Yeah. The gardens would be really interesting to do more research on. Yeah. Yeah. Anybody else? What's that noise? 4 years. Yeah, that'd be great. You're not the first. Yeah, of course.
Especially about your experiences of being here.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk to you non-Harlaxton too about coming back to England. I never thought I'd be back here for a master's, so you don't know where you'll find yourself in 2 years. But thank you very much for the opportunity. It's been
And
fun.
don't stop listening to the comments.
I wouldn't remember either. No. I mean,